Greetings friends. Thanks for stopping by for a visit. If you enjoy the video, please subscribe.
I've never shared this with anyone, but after years of trying to make sense of it, I feel like it's time. I'm an adult now, in my mid-40s, and what happened to me when I was 14 is still as vivid as it was that night. I've thought about it often, especially as I've gotten older and become more skeptical of paranormal stories. But what happened to my father and me, miles outside of Cottonwood, Arizona, in 1982, was so strange, so inexplicable, that I've never been able to completely rationalize it. I need to share it, maybe because I'm still trying to figure out what I saw. Maybe you all will have some insight. Here's the story. In the summer of 1987, my dad and I decided to take a trip to the Arizona desert. We had a 1980 Winnebago Chieftain, which my dad had lovingly restored after buying it used. He wasn't much of a talker, but he loved the idea of spending time away from the distractions of daily life. We didn't go camping much, but on the rare occasions we did, it was usually to remote places, far from the nearest town. This time, we found ourselves a few miles outside of Cottonwood, a small southwest of Sedona. The desert landscape out there was stunning. Vast stretches of scrub, mesas, and distant mountains. The air was dry and crisp, even at night. My dad and I arrived in the late afternoon, parked the Winnebago, and set up camp. We made a small fire and had dinner under the fading sun. My dad made coffee, and we didn't say much, just comfortable in the silence that had always existed between us. He wasn't big on small talk, but I think he appreciated being away from everything as much as I did. We sat by the fire as the desert night began to settle in, and I remember that feeling. The crackling of the wood, the cool breeze, the stars beginning to poke through the deepening twilight sky. It was peaceful, still, and everything felt right. But then we saw it. At first, it was just a small in the distance, barely noticeable against the sagebrush. My dad and I were both staring at the fire when I saw it, a movement out beyond the camp. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't just the wind stirring the bushes. Something was moving. A creature, I thought. A deer, perhaps. The shape was dark against the dimming desert, and it seemed to be moving in a strange, jerky pattern. "Dad, look," I said, pointing toward the movement. He turned his head, following my finger with his eyes. I could tell by the slight narrowing of his brow that he was seeing it, too. "That's odd," he muttered, taking a slow sip of his coffee. He didn't seem concerned, just curious. Probably just a mule deer. I wasn't so sure. Mule deer are common in the Arizona desert, but this one wasn't behaving the way a deer should. The animal was darting in short, rapid bursts, like it was skittish or maybe in pain. It would stop for a moment, stand completely still, then jump to one side, then freeze again. Something felt off. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. There was a flickering of movement in the bushes. Then, the deer froze, completely still. It was like everything in the world stopped. The only sound that broke the silence was the crackling of the fire. I looked over at my dad. He was still watching it, his expression unreadable. I opened my mouth to ask if we should do something, but before I could say anything, the deer changed. I wish I could say that what happened next was something I dreamed up, that I was imagining things, or that my mind played tricks on me, but that's not what happened. The mule deer, which had been perfectly still for a solid minute, slowly began to rise. At first, I thought it was simply standing up on all fours, but then I saw something I couldn't explain. It wasn't just standing. It was moving, its body shifting unnaturally. The deer's front legs bent, and with a slow, deliberate motion, the animal pushed itself upright. I watched, heart pounding in my chest, as it rose higher. Higher than any deer should be able to. It was standing on two legs now, and it wasn't some graceful, smooth movement. The whole process was jagged, like the creature was struggling against its own form, fighting something inside it. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't even know how to describe it, because in that moment, it felt like a scene from some kind of nightmare. It was still a deer in shape, at least. It had the general structure of one, but its posture was now completely human-like. The front limbs that had been hooves before were now fully extended, elongated like arms. The deer's head snapped up, its eyes glowing with a faint, unnatural light. The expression on its face, if it even had one, was not a calm one. It was wild, like it was trapped, or desperate. It didn't make any sense. I froze in place, not knowing whether to run, scream, or say something to my dad. I didn't even hear myself breathe. But before I could gather my thoughts, the creature moved again. With terrifying speed, it turned and sprinted into the distance, its strange, upright form barreling through the desert at a pace I couldn't quite process. Its long limbs flailed as it ran, but it was fast, impossibly fast. And as it ran, I swear I heard it make a sound. Not the soft rustling of hooves, but a low, distorted grunt, like a human trying to imitate an animal's cry. I snapped out of my stupor just as the thing disappeared into the darkness, leaving nothing but the faintest dust trail behind. I didn't speak for several moments. Neither did my dad. But the moment the deer disappeared from view, my mind broke. I was trembling, my chest tight with panic. I turned to my father, desperate for an explanation, but he was sitting there, unnervingly calm, staring into the distance where the creature had just been. "Dad, what the hell was that?" My voice cracked as I spoke. I didn't even know what I was asking. What had I just seen? My mind couldn't process it. My father took a slow breath, as if he were gathering his thoughts. He didn't seem afraid. No, not afraid. But I could see something in his eyes that made my stomach churn. It was a cold realization, the kind of quiet understanding that comes only with experience. He'd seen something like this before, or at least, he knew how to handle it. "Get in the RV," he said, his voice calm but firm. There was no hesitation in his tone, no question about what needed to be done. My panic flared. "What? Why? We have to do something." But my father cut me off with a sharp look. His voice lowered, almost a whisper, as if he were talking about something far more serious than just an animal sighting. "Just get in the RV. Now." I didn't argue. I bolted up from the fire, adrenaline coursing through me. My father followed at a deliberate pace, not rushing but not wasting any time. I felt like I was moving in a daze, my body acting before my mind could catch up. We got inside the Winnebago, and my father locked the door behind us. The faint smell of old upholstery filled the air as I leaned against the table, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "I don't know what that was, son," he said, his eyes still distant, scanning the outside through the small window above the sink. "But whatever it wasn't a deer. And it wasn't anything you or I need to get involved with." I was about to ask him more questions, but he cut me off again. "Start the engine. We're leaving." I didn't hesitate this time. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. The familiar hum of the Winnebago brought some sense of normalcy back, but my mind was still reeling. As we pulled away from the campfire and into the darkness of the desert, I glanced back at the fire, now a dim glow behind us. There was no sign of the creature. The rest of the drive was quiet. My father didn't speak, and I didn't push him. I don't think either of us had any real answers. The desert was vast and empty, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched by something out there, something unseen, something not of this world. We made it back to Cottonwood without another word. We didn't talk about it when we got back to the RV park, and we didn't talk about it much after that. I don't even think my dad mentioned it again. Not to me, not to anyone. It was just a strange event, a night that would remain locked in both of our minds for reasons we could never quite explain. To this day, I don't know what I saw out there in the desert, and frankly, I don't know if I want to know. I try to convince myself it was some weird trick of the light, maybe some kind of hallucination or a rare, undiscovered creature. But deep down, I know what I saw, and I've never told anyone this story until now. Thanks for reading, and if anyone has ever had an encounter like this, anything similar, please let me know. Maybe together, we can figure out what happened that night. Let me know what you think.
I'm not sure what I just experienced, but I need to share it. I've been sitting on this for a couple of days now, trying to make sense of it. I'm not one to believe in cryptids, but after what I saw a few days ago in Coconino National Forest near Flagstaff, Arizona, I'm having a hard time explaining it. I've been to Arizona a few times to visit family, but last week, I decided to take a solo trip out there to explore the outdoors. I rented an SUV, packed my camping gear, and headed out for a few days of hiking and solitude in the forest. I've hiked in some pretty remote places before, so I wasn't too concerned about being alone. Coconino Forest seemed like a perfect spot to disconnect. On the second day of my trip, I was driving along a little-used road that winds through the woods, heading toward a trail I wanted to check out. The road was narrow and winding, and the forest on either side was dense, filled with tall pines and aspens. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine needles filled the air. I had the windows down as I drove, enjoying the peace and quiet of the place. It was around late afternoon, and the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the road. Everything seemed normal at first. I wasn't in a hurry, just soaking it all in, taking my time. But that's when I noticed something odd. There was a figure standing by the side of the road, just beyond the tree line, almost hidden in the shadows. At first, I thought it was just a large animal, maybe a deer or a bear. I slowed down, my curiosity piqued, but when I got a little closer, I realized that it wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. It was tall, really tall, and it wasn't standing on four legs. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me at first, but no, this thing was standing on two legs. The creature was mostly hidden in the trees, but I could see enough to make out its shape. It had long, dark fur covering its entire body, and its posture was a strange, hunched one, as though it was either crouching or poised to run. I couldn't make out details from that distance, but I could tell it was big, bigger than any human could be. And that's when I thought to myself, no way. There's no way this is real. I started to accelerate, thinking it was probably just a trick of the light, or maybe I was overthinking it. I'd heard about the Mogollon monster before, but I never took those stories seriously. They seemed like just local myths or stories to scare people off the beaten path. But the thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching. It was unnervingly still, and the hair on the back of my neck started to rise. I felt a sudden wave of anxiety wash over me, but I told myself I was being paranoid. It's just a big animal, I thought. Maybe a bear or something. But then, as I drove past it, I caught a glimpse of its face. That was when I froze. Its face. Oh my God, its face. I still can't stop thinking about it. It wasn't an animal's face, at least not any animal I've ever seen. It was more human. Its features were vaguely human, but distorted, like something in between. The eyes were dark, and even though it was nearly dusk, they seemed to catch the light in a way that made them glow, almost. It had a long, pointed nose and a jaw that jutted out slightly. It looked like a combination of a man and some kind of giant, terrifying ape. I didn't look back. I floored the gas pedal and drove as fast as I could, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly I thought my knuckles might crack. I didn't care if I was driving too fast or if I was about to run off the road. All I could think about was getting out of there. Eventually, I pulled over, out of sheer panic. I needed to gather my thoughts. I parked near a small clearing, the engine of the SUV still humming, and I sat there for a good 5 minutes just trying to calm myself down. But the whole time, I kept telling myself, that didn't happen. It couldn't have happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I took a few deep breaths and pulled myself together, then I started the car again and drove toward the trail I had originally planned to hike. But as I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. My rational mind kept telling me it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread. I finally got to the trailhead, but I couldn't bring myself to get out of the car. Something in my gut was telling me to turn around and leave, and that's exactly what I did. I drove back to the nearest town, shaken and rattled, and spent the night in a hotel. The whole time I kept wondering, was that really the Mogollon monster? I mean, I've heard the stories, but I never thought I'd encounter something like that myself. I've been hiking in forests before, but this was different. This felt otherworldly. So, yeah, I don't know what I saw, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't just a bear or some other animal. I don't know if it was a cryptid, or something else entirely, but whatever it was not normal. And it's left me with more questions than answers. Has anyone else had an experience like this in Coconino Forest? Or anywhere else around Arizona? I can't stop thinking about it, and I'm honestly scared to go back there, even though I've always loved hiking in the area. If anyone has any insight or similar stories, I'd love to hear them.
Hey, guys. Everything I'm recounting in the story here is 100% true. I'm not going to try to persuade everyone that this is for certain a skinwalker or anything, but this crept everyone involved in this story out, including me, a pretty big skeptic when it comes to this sort of thing. I posted this here because I have no idea where else I could turn to. I'd also like to apologize for the length of this story in advance, as there's a lot that needs to be mentioned to set the scene. Here it goes. It all starts when a couple of friends, who I will refer to as Q, R, and S, and I wanted to have a guy's vacation and go camping somewhere back in May 2021. As a little backstory, Q is my best friend, and S was R's younger brother. We chose a spot that we had been to once before, but when we got there we decided to drive out another 3-ish miles away from the previous destination. The area wasn't extremely in the middle of nowhere, as some of you might think. There was a dirt road wide enough for a decent-sized truck to go up and down the road with ease. Once we decided on a place to camp, we realized that not a soul was in the general area for probably another mile. The only evidence that there was anyone near us was the distant sound of gunshots, as the shooting was allowed in this area at the time. The only things alive in the area that we could see were larger than a bird were the grazing cattle caged in by a fence. One of the main activities we would be participating in was trapping coyotes. For those of you who don't know, coyotes don't require a tag to kill and you can hunt as many as you want, as they are extremely quick to reproduce. We set up the traps about 500 yards away from our campsite in a valley that a creek was running through. We could tell that this was a bottleneck for the coyotes to travel through, as many game trails were coming down to this choke point, and we were certain at least one coyote would come through. We set up the traps and then headed back to our campsite. We got back and the sun is beginning to set. Being the middle of May, the sun was out in full force where we were at, approaching 100 degrees Fahrenheit. We were already exhausted from hauling around the heavy trapping gear, but this heat was just making it worse. It got to the point where the only thing we could do was sit in what little shade we had and wait for a couple of hours until the sun was down. A few hours later, the sun finally sets and the temperature begins to drop. We search around with our flashlights to find any dry sticks and dead sagebrush on the ground, all with the cows mooing in the background. Once we get our fire lit, we sit around and are laughing, reminiscing on old times, and just being happy to be around each other. A few minutes go by and we're all just sitting around the campfire in silence when we hear a strange high-pitched whine. I remember S asking R what that sound was, and R tells him it was probably a coyote or something. The sound keeps persisting, and whatever was making it was getting close to the campfire. Every 10 or so seconds the creature would call out. We went from laughing at it to just being confused the more we heard it and the closer it got. Then when we hear the thing call once again, probably about 40 feet or so in front of me, it's silent for only about 5 seconds this time, and not even kidding, we heard the same call, but this time from only like 20 feet behind me. This might not sound scary to a lot of you, but at the moment, it was chilling. We all scrambled up and we were feeling paranoid, so R assembles his .22 that he brought with us. Then out of nowhere, the creature is back to where it once was, about 40 or so feet in front of me again. We're all spooked and confused on how this is even happening. We all decide to try to follow that noise and see if we can find anything. It seemed to be leading us somewhere, but we weren't sure. As we followed, the thing was keeping a good distance between us, no less than 40 feet at a time. We crossed the cow fence, which was quite the task because it was coated in barbed wire. It's a bit strange too because that creature crossed through it without any sound. It kept pointing us in a direction that was leading to another creek, but as soon as we got there, we heard it from about 50 feet up a hill, which no animal could have done in that short of a time without making any noise. We got shaken up by the whole thing, so we just went back to our tent. As soon as we got up, however, Q pulled me aside and mentioned that he thought he saw something duck down when he shined his light at that hill the creature was leading us to. Throughout the night, we kept hearing that thing circle our tent, making those whining noises the entire time. We ended up spending another night there with the same things happening, but no harm came to us. The whole thing was just super unsettling. We didn't end up catching anything on that trip either. Now before any of you ask, I'm going to clarify some things. This took place in southeastern Tooele County, UT. The place we stayed was near a small town called Vernon. We're almost certain it wasn't a cow. Cows are loud, clumsy animals. I mention this because none of us heard any movement, and even the baby cows can't moo that high. At least not from the ones we heard. Also, how could it have crossed that fence? They had also gone around the hill to a different side of the owner's property. We were completely sober during the entire campout. None of us have even done drugs or drank. Maybe the heat exhaustion could have had a hand in it. We were able to find some coyote tracks, but we weren't sure if they were there before or after that night. Also, they were quite the distance away from the campsite, and they seemed to be going in completely the opposite direction from where the creature was taking us, so we ruled that out. I didn't record the descent into the valley because I got caught up in the moment. I wasn't thinking about much other than trying to figure out what that creature was. Also, my phone was very close to dying. It was most likely a coyote. That's what we thought at first, but coyotes don't sound like that. They also usually travel in packs and are extremely loud. They sound more like high-pitched dog barks. There is a chance it was a bird. That's the theory that I am trying to tell myself. It's just strange though because no other birds were out that night. We are fairly certain it was just one creature, but the truth is, we don't know for sure. But I am going to assume there was just one because the sound never played at the same time from two different areas. Also, when we had heard it from directly behind me, it never came from there again. Only straight in front of me, leading us to that creek and beyond. I am very skeptical it was some kind of skinwalker, but I honestly have no clue anymore. I did a little research on the area we stayed a few months after the whole ordeal. The area we were camping at was old Goshute territory before the Spaniards came to the valley back in the 1600s. I looked and there are hardly any Goshute legends that I could piece to something like this. I've been trying to do some research but I haven't found anything like this. Does anyone have any ideas on what this could have been?
Thanks for watching. If you want to hear more stories like these, please like and subscribe.